23rd August 1942. The Volga River, Stalingrad. The screaming started at 4 in the afternoon. Not human screaming, though that would come soon enough, but the mechanical shriek of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas diving from the sky, their Jericho sirens howling like demons descending upon the damned. Below them, the city of Stalingrad stretched along the western bank of the Volga, 500,000 souls going about their daily lives, unaware that they had minutes left before their world ended. Then the bombs fell. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombers turned the afternoon sky black with smoke and fire. Wooden houses exploded into splinters. Apartment blocks collapsed upon their inhabitants. The oil storage tanks along the river erupted in towering fireballs that could be seen 50 miles away. In the streets, mothers clutched children who would never grow up. Old men stared at the sky, unable to comprehend. By nightfall, over 40,000 civilians were dead, more than died in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki 3 years later. This was just the beginning. What followed was not merely a battle, it was a descent into hell that lasted 5 months, a horror so complete and absolute that survivors on both sides would wake screaming decades later. The world remembers Stalingrad as Germany's greatest defeat, the turning point of World War II in the East. But what the world has largely forgotten, or perhaps chosen not to remember, is the unspeakable horror behind that defeat, the cannibalism born of starvation, the wounded left to freeze in the ruins, the summary executions of retreating soldiers, the children who died clutching their mothers' frozen corpses, the rats that grew fat on human flesh, and the madness that consumed men's minds in a city where survival meant becoming something less than human. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And could you have survived what happened in Stalingrad? Not just the bullets and bombs, but the horror that came after. This is the story not just of how Germany lost Stalingrad, but of what was lost in Stalingrad, humanity itself, consumed in the frozen ruins of a city that became a graveyard for 250,000 German soldiers and perhaps twice that many Soviets and civilians. This is the forgotten horror behind Germany's greatest defeat. The Road to Hell, Operation Blau. The path to Stalingrad began not with bullets, but with oil. By the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany's war machine was running dry. The failure to capture Moscow in 1941 had been a shock to Hitler and his high command, but the Führer convinced himself that the Soviet Union could still be broken if Germany could seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Baku oil fields produced over 70% of Soviet petroleum. Without oil, the army's tanks would stop rolling, its aircraft would be grounded, and the entire Soviet war effort would collapse like a house built on sand. Operation Blau, Case Blue, was launched on 28 June 1942. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, smashed through Soviet lines with overwhelming force. Panzer divisions raced across the southern Russian steppes, their tracks churning through endless wheat fields under a merciless summer sun. Towns fell in rapid succession: Voronezh, Rostov, Milerovo. By late July, German spearheads had reached the Don River, a natural barrier snaking through the landscape. Victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. German soldiers, veterans of campaigns across Europe, believed they would be home by Christmas. But on 23 July 1942, Hitler made a decision that would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. He issued Führer Directive No. 45, splitting Army Group South into 2 separate formations. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus Mountains toward the oil fields, while Army Group B would secure the northern flank along the Volga. Half of that flank sat Stalingrad,
a sprawling industrial city of 500,000 people, stretching 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga, a vital transportation hub where the river met the railway lines connecting the Caucasus to central Russia. Originally, Stalingrad was merely a city to be isolated and bypassed, but Hitler's ego and his obsession with symbols transformed it into the primary objective. The city bore Stalin's name. To capture it would humiliate the Soviet dictator, provide a propaganda triumph that would resonate across the world, and demonstrate once and for all that German arms were invincible. Orders were issued. Stalingrad. On 12 September 1942, as German forces were already fighting in Stalingrad's suburbs, Chuikov was summoned to Stalingrad Front headquarters, located in a bunker on the eastern bank of the Volga. There he met Nikita Khrushchev, the political commissar, and General Andrei Yeremenko, the front commander. The situation was catastrophic. German forces were pushing Soviet defenders back street by street. Morale was collapsing. Units were disintegrating. Officers were requesting permission to retreat across the Volga. Yeremenko fixed Chuikov with a hard stare and asked a single question. "Comrade Chuikov, can you hold Stalingrad?" Chuikov's answer was immediate. "I will hold the city or die trying." He was given command of the 62nd Army, barely 50,000 exhausted, poorly equipped men facing a German force 5 times their size. That same night, under heavy German artillery fire, Chuikov crossed the Volga in a small boat. Shells exploded in the water around him, sending up geysers that soaked him and his staff. He reached the western bank and climbed through the smoking rubble to establish his headquarters in bunkers carved into the cliffs overlooking the river. From there, he could see the entire city, or what was left of it. Fires burned everywhere. The sky glowed orange. The sound of gunfire was constant, a symphony of death that never stopped. Chuikov understood immediately what Paulus did not. In Stalingrad, conventional military tactics were worthless. The Germans excelled at combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support working in concert across open terrain. They had perfected this doctrine in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. But in a city reduced to rubble, where every building was a fortress and every sewer a trench, where visibility was measured in meters and battles were fought room by room, those advantages vanished like morning mist. Chuikov devised a new doctrine, brutal in its simplicity: hug the enemy. Soviet soldiers would stay as close to German lines as physically possible, sometimes within 50 meters, sometimes sharing the same ruined building on different floors. This negated German air superiority. Luftwaffe bombers couldn't strike Soviet positions without hitting their own troops. German artillery had to be cautious for the same reason. The battle would be fought at grenade-throwing distance, with knives and entrenching tools, in conditions so intimate that soldiers could hear their enemies breathing through the walls. He also implemented active defense, no passive holding of lines, no waiting for the German assault. Every position would be contested with maximum aggression. If the Germans took a building in the morning, the Soviets would counterattack at dusk. The city became a meat grinder, and Chuikov fed it willingly, knowing that every day Stalingrad held was another day the Soviet High Command had to prepare the massive counteroffensive that would change everything. But first, his men had to survive. And in Stalingrad, survival required becoming something other than human. September, the city of the dead. By mid-September, the Sixth Army had penetrated deep into Stalingrad. German soldiers, many of them veterans who had fought from the Atlantic to Moscow, were unprepared for what they encountered. This was not war as they knew it. This was something primal, something that stripped away civilization and revealed the darkness beneath. The ruins themselves were a nightmare landscape, Buildings were hollow shells, their walls pockmarked by thousands of bullet holes and shell fragments. Floors collapsed into basements, creating vertical mazes where up and down lost meaning. Staircases ended in mid-air. Doorways opened onto nothing. The air was thick with dust and smoke that burned lungs and turned visibility to mere feet. Dead bodies, Soviet, German, civilian, lay everywhere, rotting in the summer heat, covered with flies. The smell was indescribable, a sweet, sick stench of death that clung to uniforms and invaded dreams.
Snipers made movements suicidal. Soviet marksmen, hidden in the ruins with scoped Mosin Nagant rifles, could put a bullet through a man's eye from 300 meters. They were patient, invisible, capable of waiting hours for a single shot. German soldiers learned to move in short, unpredictable bursts, never to silhouette themselves against the sky, never to follow the same route twice. Many learned too late. One Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, would personally kill over 200 German soldiers during the battle, becoming a propaganda hero and the subject of films decades later. Booby traps were everywhere. Corpses rigged with explosives, doors wired to grenades, water bottles filled with acid. German soldiers learned to trust nothing, to treat every object as a potential death sentence. The psychological toll was immense. Men jumped at shadows. Paranoia became rational. Sleep brought nightmares of traps and ambushes. The fighting was savage beyond description. German combat engineers used flamethrowers to clear Soviet positions, spraying liquid fire into basements where defenders huddled. The screams of men burning alive echoed through the ruins, a sound that drove some soldiers mad. Soviet soldiers responded with Molotov cocktails, bottles filled with gasoline, kerosene, and sulfuric acid that turned men into human torches. Hand-to-hand combat was not occasional, it was routine. Soldiers strangled each other in stairwells, fought with bayonets and entrenching tools, clubbed each other with rifle butts, used their bare hands when weapons were lost. One German officer wrote in his diary, later published, "We have fought for 15 days for a single house. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. It is the length of a corridor between two windows. From story to story, faces black with sweat, we bombard each other with grenades in the middle of explosions, clouds of dust and smoke, heaps of mortar, floods of blood, fragments of furniture and human beings. The street is no longer measured in meters, but in corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace, and when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier newly arrived in Stalingrad was 24 hours. For junior officers, it was 3 days. Reinforcements crossed the Volga at night in boats and barges, under constant German artillery fire. Many never reached the western bank. Bodies floated downstream. The Volga, witnesses said, ran red. Those who made it across were thrown immediately into combat, often dying before they learned their comrades' names. But the horror was only beginning. As autumn turned to winter, something worse than bullets and bombs would come to Stalingrad: starvation, cold, and the madness they brought with them. The fortress within hell, Pavlov's house, and Mamayev Kurgan. Amid the chaos, certain locations became legendary symbols of Soviet resistance. The most famous was a 4-story apartment building on Solechnia Street, defended by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and fewer than 20 men, Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Jews, a microcosm of the Soviet Union. On 27 September, Pavlov's reconnaissance unit seized the building in a nighttime assault and decided to stay. Over 48 hours, they transformed it into a fortress.
Windows were barricaded with bricks, leaving only narrow firing slits. Interior walls were punched through to create hidden positions and escape routes. Mines ringed the perimeter. Barbed wire crisscrossed approaches. The basement became a command post. The roof became a sniper's nest. A communication trench connected Pavlov's house to Soviet lines, allowing resupply and reinforcement. For 58 days, Pavlov's house held against everything the Wehrmacht could throw at it. German infantry assaulted it repeatedly, sometimes twice daily. Panzers rolled up and fired point-blank, their 75mm shells punching through brick but failing to dislodge the defenders. Stukas dropped bombs that collapsed one corner, but the Soviets simply shifted to other rooms. The building became a skeleton of brick and rebar, barely recognizable as human habitation, yet Pavlov's men never surrendered. They survived through ingenuity and desperation. Soviet artillery across the Volga, coordinated by a forward observer on the roof, devastated German formations before they could close in. Anti-tank rifles in the basement knocked out armored vehicles at close range. Machine guns covered every approach. At night, supplies came through the trench, ammunition, water, bread when available. During lulls, Pavlov's men slept in shifts, huddled together for warmth, listening to the sounds of battle that never ceased. Equally savage was the fighting for Mamayev Kurgan, a hill rising 102 meters above the city center. From its summit, artillery observers could direct fire across the entire battlefield. Whoever controlled Mamayev Kurgan.
The aftermath, a horror too great to remember. Stalingrad was rebuilt, renamed Volgograd in 1961. The Mamayev Kurgan Memorial, dominated by an 85-meter statue of Mother Russia raising a sword, stands over the hill where so many died. Tourists visit, veterans weep. But what is memorialized is the victory, the triumph of Soviet arms, the turning point of the war. What is largely forgotten, what survivors on both sides rarely spoke of, was the descent into inhuman horror, the cannibalism, the madness, the moral collapse that occurred when men were pushed beyond the limits of endurance. German veterans, those few who survived, carried the shame and trauma to their graves. Soviet veterans, heroes of the Great Patriotic War, buried their own horrors under propaganda and silence. Who would believe that the noble defenders of Stalingrad had also been driven to unspeakable acts? Who wanted to hear about the Soviet soldiers who executed their own comrades for cowardice, the civilians abandoned to starve, the wounded left to die because morphine was reserved for those who could still fight? The world remembers Stalingrad as Germany's greatest defeat, the battle that turned the tide. That is true. But it was also something else, a place where the veneer of civilization was stripped away, where men discovered what they were capable of when survival became the only law. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides suffered unimaginably. Both sides lost their humanity in the frozen ruins. Chuikov survived and accepted Berlin's surrender in 1945. Paulus testified at Nuremberg and died in obscurity in East Germany in 1957. Pavlov became a hero of the Soviet Union. Zaitsev, the sniper, became a legend. But the thousands who froze, starved, and descended into madness, their names are forgotten. The horror they experienced, the things they did to survive, were too terrible to memorialize. Legacy. The horror we choose to forget. Stalingrad teaches us that war is not merely combat, it is the destruction of everything human, morality, sanity, dignity. The battle demonstrated what happens when ideology overrides reason, when leaders value symbols over soldiers' lives, when military goals become more important than human survival. The forgotten horror of Stalingrad is not just the death toll, though that was staggering.
It is what the battle revealed about humanity's capacity for suffering and for inflicting suffering. It showed how quickly civilization collapses when food runs out, when cold becomes unbearable, when death surrounds you and offers the only escape. We remember Stalingrad as a triumph of Soviet resistance, a testament to courage and determination. That is part of the truth, but the complete truth includes the horror, the cannibalism born of starvation, the madness born of trauma, the moral compromises made to survive one more day. These are the parts of Stalingrad that history books often omit, that memorials don't mention, that veterans couldn't speak about without weeping. The soldiers who fought at Stalingrad, German and Soviet alike, were not monsters, though they were forced to do monstrous things. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary horror, pushed beyond the breaking point, forced to choose between death and actions that would haunt them forever. Many chose death. Others chose survival at any cost. Neither choice was wrong, neither was right. In Stalingrad, such distinctions ceased to matter. This was the forgotten horror behind Germany's greatest defeat, not merely the military catastrophe of losing an entire army, but the human catastrophe of what men became in the process. It is a horror we must remember, not to glorify or condemn, but to understand the true cost of war, paid not just in bodies, but in souls. But while Stalingrad marked the turning point in the East, another battle was brewing in the frozen forests of Belgium, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allies and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Join us next time as we uncover the story of the Battle of the Bulge, where American soldiers faced their own frozen hell and emerged victorious. Until then, remember those who suffered in Stalingrad, and never forget the horror that war brings, not just to bodies, but to the human spirit itself.
The forgotten horror, starvation, cannibalism, and madness. December 1942 brought temperatures that plummeted to -30, -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers in summer uniforms began to freeze. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, noses. Every night, hundreds froze to death at their posts, their bodies discovered at dawn, frozen solid in positions of agony. But worse than the cold was the hunger. Food supplies inside the pocket ran out within weeks. The Luftwaffe's aerial supply effort was a catastrophic failure. On good days, perhaps 100 tons reached the pocket, 1/5 of what was needed. Many days, no supplies arrived at all. Horses were slaughtered and eaten, then rats, then anything organic, leather belts boiled into soup, boot soles cut into strips and chewed, wallpaper paste mixed with water. By late December, starvation was killing more men than Soviet bullets. Soldiers became walking skeletons, their uniforms hanging loose on wasted frames, their eyes hollow and haunted. The cold and hunger created a lethal combination. Bodies too weak to generate heat froze faster. Wounded men died not from their injuries, but from starvation. Their bodies lacked the energy to heal. And then the unthinkable began. Whispers spread through the encirclement. Bodies of dead comrades, already stripped of clothing and equipment, were found with flesh cut away. At first, these were dismissed as animal predation. Then the truth could no longer be denied. Cannibalism had come to the Sixth Army. It started with the dead. In the desperate calculus of survival, some soldiers reasoned that the dead no longer needed their flesh, but the living did. Bodies found in isolated positions would be discovered with thigh muscles carved away, organs removed. Soviet interrogators of German prisoners later documented numerous cases.
One prisoner confessed, "We were not animals. We were simply men who wanted to live." The dead could not object. But as January 1943 dragged on and starvation intensified, darker rumors circulated. Stories of soldiers who went to sleep and never woke, their throats cut by comrades who could no longer distinguish between right and wrong. Stories of the wounded left in aid stations who disappeared overnight. German military courts held hasty trials and executed men for cannibalism. But executions required bullets desperately needed for combat. Many cases were never investigated. The horror was simply too widespread, too overwhelming to confront. Soviet soldiers advancing into the pocket in January found scenes that traumatized them for life. German bunkers filled with emaciated corpses, some with flesh cut away. Frozen bodies stacked like firewood, many showing signs of butchery. One Soviet officer wrote, "We thought we had seen everything war could show us. We were wrong. What we found in the German positions was beyond comprehension. These were not soldiers anymore. They were ghosts, living corpses who had descended into hell." Medical supplies vanished by late December. Morphine ran out. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia, holding patients down while they screamed. Many died from shock. Frostbite required constant amputation, toes, fingers, feet, hands. The aid stations became charnel houses filled with the dying and those who wished they were dead. Psychological collapse was rampant. Men went mad, some from starvation, others from trauma, others from the sheer impossibility of their situation. They wandered the ruins, talking to themselves, to the dead, to God. Some committed suicide, shooting themselves or stepping into Soviet fire. Officers looked away. What did it matter? They would all be dead soon anyway. January 1943, the final horror. On 8 January 1943, the Red Army offered surrender terms. Paulus, still following Hitler's orders, refused. On 10 January, Operation Ring began, the final assault. Soviet artillery fired over 1 million shells in 3 hours. Infantry advanced behind walls of fire. The pocket shrank daily. German soldiers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, defended their positions with the desperation of men who knew they were forgotten. Some fought with fanatical courage, others surrendered immediately, too weak to resist. The pocket was split in two by late January. All organized resistance collapsed. Men huddled in cellars, burning furniture for warmth, eating anything, sawdust, birch bark, human flesh. On 30th January, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was an implicit order to commit suicide. Paulus refused. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters. He surrendered along with his staff. The South Pocket ceased to exist. The Northern Pocket held 2 more days before collapsing on 2 February 1943. Of 250,000 encircled men, only 90,000 survived to become prisoners. Of those, barely 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet prison camps. Typhus, dysentery, starvation, the after-effects of frostbite and trauma. They had survived Stalingrad only to die in captivity. Soviet losses were equally staggering, over 1.1 million casualties during the 5-month battle. Civilian deaths exceeded 40,000 in the initial bombing alone, with thousands more dying during the battle. In total, perhaps 2 million people, soldiers, civilians. Soviet soldiers defending the hill called it the height of death. German soldiers called it the hill of corpses. Both were accurate. Bodies lay stacked like cordwood. Wounded men, unable to be evacuated, froze to death overnight. In summer, the corpses rotted and bloated. In winter, they froze solid and were used as sandbags. The stench was so overwhelming that soldiers vomited when the wind shifted. Yet they fought on, day after day, because orders said hold, and retreat meant execution by NKVD blocking detachments positioned behind the lines. October-November, the factories and the closing of the trap. As autumn brought cold rains that turned rubble into mud, the battle shifted to Stalingrad's northern industrial district. 3 massive factory complexes that dominated the landscape: the Barricady gun factory, the Red October steel plant, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor works. Before the war, these had produced tanks, artillery, and steel. Now they produced only death. These were not ordinary buildings, but sprawling industrial labyrinths covering square kilometers: workshops, warehouses, assembly halls, blast furnaces, railway sidings. Soviet workers who had built T-34 tanks now fought alongside soldiers to defend the factories. Workshops became bunkers, assembly lines became trenches. Blast furnaces, some still radiating residual heat, provided warmth in freezing nights. Overhead cranes offered sniper positions. The factories were defenders' dreams and attackers' nightmares, 3-dimensional mazes where ambush was inevitable. The Germans threw everything at the factories. Paulus committed his reserves. Entire divisions were ground down to company strength. The 24th Panzer Division, once 15,000 men and hundreds of tanks, was reduced to a few dozen operational vehicles and a couple thousand infantry. Soldiers fought room by room, machine by machine. In the Red October plant, German and Soviet soldiers occupied different floors of the same building, separated by ceilings that shook with grenades and gunfire. One Soviet lieutenant, Anatoly Mereshko, later recalled, "We fought in the foundry. There were still vats of molten metal from before the evacuation. Men fell into them, pushed, stumbling, blown backward. The screams, you never forget those screams. They ended quickly. The smell lingered for days." The fighting was so close that artillery became useless. Mortars and grenades were primary weapons. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga nightly and were thrown immediately into combat. Many died within hours, yet the line held, barely, by centimeters, but it held. While Paulus fixated on the factories, grinding his army down in street fighting, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was planning Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive to encircle the entire Sixth Army. On 19 November 1942, Soviet forces struck the flanks of Army Group B, held by poorly equipped Romanian divisions. The Romanian lines collapsed. On 22 November, Soviet pincers met west of Stalingrad. The trap was closed. Over 250,000 German soldiers were encircled. Paulus requested permission to break out. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would stand fast. Hermann Göring promised to supply the pocket by air, 500 tons daily. It was a lie. The Luftwaffe never delivered more than a fraction of that. And then winter came.